All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today, we have another very special interview with Dr. Dustin Crummett. We're going to be talking about applied ethics generally and a number of more specific topics within the field of applied ethics. Dustin has written a number of papers on issues in this field, so it's something of an expert, I'd say. I think he. So we're going to have him. We're going to go through a couple prominent issues that are often discussed in applied ethics after talking a little bit about what applied ethics is. And just as a heads up, if you are interested in reading some of Dustin's papers or keeping an eye out or keeping up with any more of his stuff, I will link in the description of this video his page where you can find his CV, his research projects, and everything that he's working on. So if you're interested in that, which you should be, take a look at that and read his papers if you can. I'll also put a link to his philpapers page and everything down there. So all that being said, Dustin, thanks for coming back. It's good to have you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay. So let's start off then, I guess, with just letting everybody know what is applied ethics. We're talking about we're going to be talking about some topics in applied ethics, like things like abortion and gun control. But what is applied ethics? And what makes it different from other things in ethics, like say meta ethics or or what have you.
Right. Yeah, so it's pretty typical, I guess, to think that ethics, broadly speaking, falls into kind of like three big areas. So there's meta ethics, and this involves questions like, what are the nature of ethical properties? I mean, do they exist independently of human minds, or do they just depend upon our subjective preferences? Are they natural properties? Are they non-natural properties, like more thoughts say? Are there ethical properties at all, or is ethical language doing something quite different than asserting propositions? Maybe it's just saying something's wrong is just saying boo that thing, boo to murder. Maybe it's just a kind of expressive attitudinal function. So that's meta ethics. Then you have what's sometimes called normative ethics, or maybe ethical theory, this sort of stuff. And there, more or less, you're attempting to figure out, in substantive terms, what makes right acts right and wrong acts wrong. What is sort of like the general way of characterizing what all the right acts have in common. So this is where you run into ethical theories like utilitarianism, Kantianism, contractualism, virtue ethics, natural law theory, etc. And then applied ethics deals with more specific, controversial moral issues, things like euthanasia, abortion, gun control, the ethics of meat eating, the ethics of charitable donation, the ethics of punishment, all these sorts of things, the ethics of warfare. All of these sorts of things fall under the rubric of applied ethics. I guess that the field has its name because the theory is that you're kind of, you're applying the general theoretical insights to specific concrete problems. Though actually that's not always what you do. I mean, there are kind of different methodologies. So you might think that you can do a lot of applied ethics without committing to any particular ethical theory, say, either because you can maybe find mid-level principles that different ethical theories will agree on. They'll all agree that you shouldn't go around hurting people without a good reason, that sort of thing. Or you might just be able to reason, say, from certain clear intuitions about cases. Singer has this famous shallow pond argument. Well, if you see a kid drowning, then you should save them. But, and then from that tries to argue that you're required to give a lot of your money to charity. And that there, he does give another version of the argument that applies to sort of a principle. But that version of the argument doesn't apply to a principle at all. It just applies to sort of an analogy between two cases. So that's something like what applied ethics is the ethical study of these sort of particular concrete ethical issues that people disagree about, that people want the answers to.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, it's a good introduction. Well, you kind of just touched on it a second ago, but just to get a little more clear, this is a question I'd had is kind of the connection between I'm not too concerned with like meta ethics in this, but like our normative ethical theories and the implications they have for applied ethics. So are people, so say, you know, if I'm a virtue ethicist and you're a deontologist, are we going to be able to agree on anything in applied ethics, or are we going to be able to agree on some things, not others? So what exact implications do our normative ethics, because like in these applied ethics cases, if all we're doing is just kind of taking our normative ethics and applying them to cases, and it seems the real debate is in normative ethics and which of those is right. So what's the connection between those two, if at all? Or could we kind of all have all the different normative theories, then believe the same thing in an applied case? Or how does that connection work?
Right. So it's going to depend, basically, on the topic somewhat. It may be that, well, yeah, I mean, so there are sort of different approaches, but it may be that you and I hold different theories, and our different theories just yield different judgments here, right? I had a discussion over on Joe Smith's channel the other day about natural law arguments against homosexuality. And so that really does seem to me, I mean, one thing that I wanted to question was whether you actually, from the natural law theory, from the natural law framework, could get the impermissibility of homosexuality. But suppose you could, none of the other theories are going to endorse this style of reasoning. So it's kind of the natural law theorist against the field here. So there, maybe you really would need to drill down into the theoretical issues to figure out who's right. Or alternatively, you might be able to say, look, this conclusion is so implausible that gives us reason to reject your theory. What am I more sure about? You know, if somebody's ethical theory implies that the Holocaust was okay, then you would say, well, okay, that's good grounds for just rejecting their theory.
Yeah. Could almost be a Morian thing there, where it's like something has gone wrong somewhere.
Yeah, right. But there are other cases where it looks like there will be enough convergence between ethical theories that the real debate might not really be at the level of which ethical theory is correct. The real debate might instead be at the level of what sort of effects does a certain action have, or maybe we both agree that people have a right to life, but we have some sort of disagreement about what that right to life entails. What does it entail having other people do things for you, or does it merely entail other people not killing you? So there are other instances where there will be enough convergence between different ethical theories. Or maybe, say, in the case of an argument from cases, maybe I agree, you know, without even thinking about my ethical theory, maybe I agree with your judgment on a certain case, and then you try to say that it's analogous to something else. And maybe I think it's analogous, maybe I don't. If I don't, maybe that's because of something from my theory. I say, my theory says this is a morally relevant difference. Maybe it's not. Maybe I just say, well, intuitively, you know, maybe it is different that blah, 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 right? So, I think basically there are different approaches, and whether you can do it in a way that abstracts away from controversial theoretical questions will depend a little bit on what kind of argument you're trying to give, and a little bit on what the topic in question is.
Okay, right, yeah, no, that seems right. That's what I assumed. I was like, it was going to probably be different for different cases, but there is an interesting question there. And with applied ethics, there's a lot of stuff. Some of these cases, like there's really complicated metaphysics that comes in too, which we'll talk about in a second when we get to like abortion. So I guess the last thing is, so why is very briefly, I mean, this should be obvious from what you've said already, but just to say it explicitly, why is applied ethics important, and where can we use it, like in everyday life and in politics? Like maybe with political decisions, we can kind of like see like, well, this policy is going to have this consequence, or so just, I guess, briefly, why is it important? Although that's pretty obvious, but.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's important because it's dealing with kind of real world ethical questions that you want to know the answer to, you know. It might turn out that some things that are commonly accepted, maybe eating meat, you would never think of as even a moral issue, you know. Lots of people want to deny that it's even a morally relevant issue, you know. They think that, well, if you don't want to eat meat, then that's fine, but like don't bother other people about it, you know. It's just a personal choice. And that turns out, I think, to be a very hard position to defend, right? Because, well, you're affecting these animals, and if they have any kind of moral standing, then it's not just a personal choice, right? Of course, there's an analogous position that people take sometimes with abortion. Well, if you don't want an abortion, don't get one. And a pro-life person can reasonably say, well, wait a minute, I'm claiming that the fetus is a person that's, being unjustly killed. So of course that's,
Right.
it might turn out that some things that you wouldn't think of as ethical choices turn out to be ethical choices. It might turn out that the common sense understanding of them is incorrect at some points. It might turn out in the case of controversial ethical issues that there is no single common sense understanding, and you want to know, is euthanasia okay? Well, I'm not sure. Different people have different views. Is there some reasonable way to approach this? It might turn out that some of your own views are inconsistent, and then you think, I said this thing in response to this issue, but doesn't that commit me to some other judgment on this other issue that I don't want that. And now I've got to rethink what I said about this other thing. So I think it's useful because these are very important questions. I mean, it matters whether you do the right thing or not, and because even though maybe a lot of the time you can sort of just intuitively judge what the right thing to do is, and you're going to be fine. There are also cases where common sense, common opinion, these sorts of things, maybe it could lead you astray or doesn't give a clear answer. And then it's important to sort of think things through and try to come to the best judgment you can so that you have the best chance of behaving in a morally defensible way.
Right. Okay. Awesome. I think this field is one that's probably a good, in some cases at least, a good entry point for people into philosophy even, because there's this kind of common conception of philosophy, like, oh, you guys are just thinking about stuff that no one cares about, and self-reflecting, all the stuff that doesn't make sense, it doesn't have any application. And so this might be a good entry point to give people hey, no, this is a field of philosophy that's dealing with stuff that's happening now and whether or not it's right or wrong, and this is super important. And maybe if we had people doing this all throughout history, we would have avoided some really bad things. So I think this is a good entry point to get people to take philosophy seriously. No, this is what a lot of philosophers are doing, because I've seen some figures. I think a lot of philosophers do work in ethics, as far as a majority of just general. So, which I think is good, because it's one of the most important fields, if not the most. Okay, so I think that's all good by way of introduction to applied ethics itself. And just as a note, I'm going to flag it for myself. I'm very excited for that discussion, even though it sounds like Scalco flaked on you, but it worked out either way. I'm excited for that one. But okay, well, now that we have that out of the way, just the preliminaries, thanks for that. That was a good intro. Let's talk about a couple cases. So as you mentioned going through, we're going to talk about a couple that are very kind of relevant today. They're policy. And I think another reason it's important is it has real world effects for political decisions, right? So if you're trying to think of what candidate, some people are voting for a candidate, a lot of people on the right now are saying they have these Christian convictions that tell them that Donald Trump's a horrible person and a lot of his policies are bad, but they have to vote for the pro-life candidate. So there are a lot of these applied ethics issues where it gets down to the root of that, and it has implications for decisions that are going to affect an entire nation. So that's another reason why it's super important. It's going to have follow through on your voting decisions. Same with gun control and animal stuff we're going to talk about, and environmental ethics especially. So it's just the importance can't be overstated. So as we said, we're going to start off with an easy one, relatively uncontroversial, abortion. Pretty easy one. So let's start off with. I actually recently, if anybody's interested, I did recently do a video. I don't have the book right handy, but I recently have a video on the channel. It's about 40 minutes long that I did, just kind of that serves as an introduction to abortion and philosophy and kind of the conversation. The video I made is pretty much just a video version of Nathan Nobis and Christina Grobe's book, Thinking Critically About Abortion. So if you're interested in getting a broad introduction to this, check out that video, and then Dustin and I are going to talk about some more specific stuff. So one thing that is talked about in that book is how we should even define abortion, because there are question begging. Sometimes people say, well, abortion is just defined as murdering a child. It's okay, well, that seems like it's wrong, so we should probably, but that also seems like it's a bad definition because it's question begging, and there are some definitions that are just really imprecise, like it's terminating a pregnancy. Well, you could technically terminate a pregnancy accidentally. There seems to be some intentionality behind abortion, so there's kind of this question of how do we even characterize this in a morally neutral way that still accurately captures what's actually going on. So what do you think? How should we define abortion in a way that's most accurate for these applied ethics cases?
Yeah, I guess so I've read parts of their book. I'm going to feel silly if I say something that they have some devastating objection to. But I guess, I mean, I've always thought of it as something like intentional termination of a pregnancy. So
Okay.
that's a kind of, uh, not a loaded description either way. It doesn't presuppose any particular moral status. The definition leaves open whether that's a permissible or an impermissible thing to do. It seems like that gets rid of the worry about, accidental, miscarriages
Yeah.
or accidental cases where you accidentally do something that terminates the pregnancy or something. So
Yeah. Yeah, because they say like termination's not good because of those cases, but if you bring in the caveat that's intentional, the definition they use is intentional killing of a fetus in order to terminate a pregnancy or something. So, I mean, they say killing's morally neutral, but that still kind of has some connotations. I think if we say intentional, then termination, because one of my friends brought this up too. Sometimes there's not as much of an active killing. Sometimes it's more of like withholding resources from the fetus. That's how some abortions go. So there is intention, but not necessarily direct killing. So termination actually might be the best way to put it, as long as it's specified that it's intentional. So I think that's good. So we don't have to. This is a topic that we could do an entire video on probably. So we can just kind of go through it briefly. But there is a kind of philosophical literature on what is it that makes death bad. Like, what does it make that it makes killing wrong? Like when we kill something, when something dies, what are we depriving it of such that it's bad, like it's wrong or it's harmed in that it's killed? So in order to talk about any of these cases in killing, so even if it's killing in war, but the topics that are even tougher are like abortion and euthanasia, because the way Jeff McMahon's put them is they're problems at the margins of life. They're kind of like, when we have killing in war, it's very clear that we have like, actively alive human persons that have intentions and psychological connection to their futures. So these cases where we have like brain death or severe comatose, or it's kind of like before full conscious development, these margins of life cases make killing more complicated. So we need kind of like a really rigorous and well worked out account of what it is that even makes death bad and killing wrong in the cases that it is wrong. Because of course it's not always wrong to kill things that are alive. That's just very, very uncontroversial. So, but what is it that makes death bad? So we're going to have to, I think, cover that as a preliminary. So again, this is like a whole, there are books on just this topic, but just very brief, like generally, I guess, or briefly, what do you think should be the best account of what makes death bad in the first place?
Right. So what makes death bad? I mean, basically, there are going to be multiple. I mean, maybe unsurprisingly, there are going to be multiple factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an obvious fact is that, well, at least if the remainder of my life, had I lived, would have contained good things in it, then I'm not going to get those now, right? So this is sometimes called the deprivation account.
Mm-hmm.
There were various good experiences I could have had in the future, say, if I had lived. Now I'm dead, so I'm not going to get those experiences. So it's bad sort of comparatively because it deprives me of these good things that I could have had otherwise, right? And yeah, okay, so that seems plausible. That seems like it must be at least a big part of it. Now, you might wonder whether say, a very early fetus actually will have good experiences in its future, say, because you might wonder metaphysically whether it's the same individual.
Mm-hmm.
Did I exist 6 weeks after my mom conceived? Or did I not come into existence until later? There was some sort of organism, but maybe I'm not identical to that organism, say. But I mean, suppose that a very early fetus is, or suppose that a recently fertilized egg is the same individual. You might worry, okay, now this seems to generate cases where actually it's much worse for a fetus or for an egg that was fertilized 24 hours ago for it to die than for, say, a 5-year-old kid to die. Because the 5-year-old has already lived 5 years of his life, right? He's got less future goodness, assuming that they have the same lifespan, than this recently fertilized egg. Even apart from the question about whether the fertilized egg is the same individual, presumably, say, a newborn baby is the same individual, but still, you wouldn't intuitively maybe think that it's much worse for a baby to die than for a slightly older child to die. So that might make you think, okay, there must be other factors at play here, right? So it's not just deprivation of future goods that's relevant. But what else might be relevant? I mean, one thing is that I want to live, right? And presumably once you, at least once you're a couple years old, there are various things you want to do in the future. You want to continue living maybe for its own sake, but you also want to do stuff with the rest of your life, right? And you're not going to get to do any of that stuff. So you'll have a lot of frustrated preferences. That might be bad in and of itself. You might think that it's a way of, say, disrespecting your agency if I kill you and prevent you from doing all that stuff. Maybe there's just something bad in general about leaving behind all this unfinished business, all these projects that get cut short. You have relationships with other people that will be cut short. Other people are kind of invested in you and they're going to feel bad if you die. Maybe that's not bad for you. It's bad more broadly. Oftentimes dying is scary or is painful. It depends on how you die, of course. But so it looks like there are a whole suite of other reasons why death can be bad too. And unlike just the sort of future amount of future goods, some of those apply more strongly to people who are a little bit older, right? So, when you're 20, you have a lot more life projects and a lot more deep relationships or whatever than you were when you were a 28-week-old fetus or something like that. Those might also be part of what makes death bad. And there can also be maybe like complicated interactions. So Jeff McMahon, I think, for instance, thinks that part of how strong your interest in your future well-being is depends upon the degree of psychological continuity that exists between you and your future self. If this person's going to be very, very psychologically different from you, then you kind of have less of a stake in their well-being. And so that might make it actually kind of more of a deprivation for me to die than for, say, a 28-week-old fetus to die, because there's, I guess, no psychological continuity or only very minimal psychological continuity between the very early fetus and their future self, whereas there's much, much stronger and much deeper psychological continuity between me and my future self, right? So there are other ways that the story can get very, very complicated. But basically, the short answer is there are going to be a host of reasons, some of which have to do with kind of things being interrupted or cut short, sort of the badness of having to stop too soon after things have got going, and others of which have to do with just generally the fact that you're being deprived of certain future goods.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so let me take a note down here. Yeah, all right, good. That was a good intro. I'm glad you mentioned Jeff McMahon. I love Jeff McMahon. He's great. He has a book, if anybody's interested. McMahon has like a huge, like 500-page book that's pretty much devoted entirely to like abortion and euthanasia cases, where he goes through all this, like the metaphysics of persons and the badness of death. Like, it's super comprehensive. It's amazing. So if you're interested in this topic, give that a read, as well as, of course, everything that Dustin's written and is going to write. Okay, so that's good to get like an introduction. It seems like, there's like multiple complex factors. We can generally have an idea of like some things people agree upon that makes death bad, and we're going into talking about these cases. So it's not like we're going to have some crazy, because nobody thinks it's bad to kill like bacteria, right? Like, or like, a skin cell, if you have like, some human cells in a petri dish. So when people say things like, this is one point that people bring up a lot when you talk about abortion online. They'll just be like, well, my biology textbook says life begins at conception, so you believe in baby murder. And it's like, I don't know if you have any responses to that you'd like to, but I mean, the very simple one is, of course, that it's just not wrong to kill things that are biologically alive as a universal rule. So I don't know, that kind of common, I don't know if it's like a sophistry move, just being like, life begins at conception. So I don't know.
I did have a professor at Notre Dame who thought that it was wrong to kill bacteria.
Really?
Unless you had to do it to survive. He wanted a sort of biocentric view where like all living things have moral standing.
Wow.
I didn't Yeah, I mean, that didn't seem right to me. But I asked him once about antibacterial dish soap. And he said, well, you have to use that to survive. And I was like, I don't think so. I mean, people got by for a while before there was antibacterial dish soap.
Oh,
But
that's too good.
yeah, so, but yeah, I mean, so this idea, well, life begins at conception, and so it's wrong to have abortion. I mean, uh, so this is uncontroversial. There's some sort of human organism that comes to be at conception, right? Um, Now, presumably, what we really care about is not whether there's a human organism there as such, but maybe something like, is there a person there? Or is there a being with the right to life? Or at the very least, is there some being who possesses whatever the features are that make it wrong to kill other individuals? Does this being possess those features yet? You could hold the view, and some people do hold the view, that actually, yeah, being a human organism is what makes it wrong to kill you. This sort of I don't know, almost species membership view. But that's not something that's in the biology textbook, right? That doesn't follow trivially from just the claim that there is a human organism there. That's a sort of a different. Yeah, I mean, that's a different moral view that you're sort of pulling in to try to get your conclusion. It's one that I don't think is all that attractive.
Yeah, no.
But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, for a number of reasons, right? I mean, like there's a couple obvious ones just right off the bat. Like for one thing, we want an account of killing that isn't just applicable to human organisms, like things like human DNA. There's to be something that makes it wrong for. Like in your recent interview on eating meat, you talked about your cats that are usually, are they there with you this time? Because they usually are.
Yeah, they are. Where is? Oh, yeah, they're both over here.
Oh yeah, see. So we want a moral account that would make it wrong for you to just like grab your cat and smack it into a wall and kill it, right? So just saying like, we want an account that builds in more than just this kind of species membership, as you said, and also, I mean, like tumors. And there are like things with human DNA that like organisms that are just kind of and also brain dead people, technically human organisms, but what kind of interest do they have in staying alive? So I agree with you that that's not an attractive account at all, at least with that just that caveat. So
yeah, I do think they have maybe some things to say about I mean, the tumor, for instance, is not a human organism, so maybe if you say no, I'm not just saying anything with human DNA, but specifically things.
Right.
Human beings. Though, yeah, I mean, there are these other cases where, say, suppose someday I become brain dead and I'm still a functioning organism. It might be that before, when I was conscious and so on, I had certain desires about what should happen to me after I become brain dead, and maybe that makes it morally relevant. But otherwise, it does seem pretty clear that in that case, say, taking me off life support or killing me would be quite different than killing me at some earlier point in my life when I still, had
I think the tumor thing was the counterexample. Yeah, I think the tumor thing was just about more like organs, and then organisms are more complex.
Yeah.
There's more to, but then
it depends on whether the person is saying what matters is just being human in some
and being
capacious, just having human DNA. Or maybe something a little more focused. So, yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's true. So, well, as you mentioned there, so you kind of alluded to it. This is kind of where things get complex. So, a lot of people use a lot of terms when they're talking about this. Sometimes it's human being or human organism or person. And so it seems like a lot of these things are just different ways of saying person, at least to me. But I think we also, again, want an account of killing that maybe accounts for things that are not persons, unless I think it's plausible that some animals are persons, but probably not all. But we still need an account of why it's wrong to kill some non-person organisms. But purely when we're talking about the abortion case, personhood comes up a lot. People say, well, fetuses are human persons, and it's wrong to kill human persons without any kind of justifiable reason, or trying to kill innocent human persons or what have you. So this is where we need to get into like our accounts of personhood. Like if we're going to say these things are persons, what does that mean for what personhood entails? So, I mean, just, you know, in the general literature, like not even necessarily bioethics, but if you just read like philosophy dictionaries, a lot of times the definition of personhood wants to say something about capacity for like abstract thought or using language in some sort of like linguistic community, and having like these certain features that we really only associate with like, pretty well developed human organisms or persons or like beings, whatever we want to call it. So it seems like just kind of in the general common sense view, when we talk about persons, we kind of have a lot that's built in there. But then when it gets to the abortion debate, people also want to like say they kind of want to go more minimal on definition of person. So this is where I wanted to talk a little bit about what are your views on personhood and how it relates to the abortion cases. There's also some interesting stuff on whether or not like souls come into play. So this is sort of like a mixture of like metaphysics and philosophy of mind, right? Like there's kind of like the metaphysical account, like I think it's like David Oderberg is one that's written a lot on like the hylomorphist account of personhood and how that makes it wrong to kill from early stages. And McMahon has a good discussion of that in his book. But so there's like metaphysics and philosophy of mind that comes into play. So I guess with that caveat, what are kind of your views on personhood and how does this relate to the abortion cases?
Oh yeah. So I mean, generally you might think something like, look, there are these substance views, like the Oderberg view. I'm a certain kind of substance. I may say like a hylomorph. I'm an organism, and I have my moral status in virtue of the kind of thing that I am, where that's understood not quite in the, that has to be understood in a way that's like fleshed out in a very specific way metaphysically, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have like the essence of a rational animal, even if I'm not currently rational, and I'm maybe even I'm never going to be rational and so on. The pro-choice side tends to be more sympathetic to maybe a more like psychologized account. No, it's not just having the capacity to do these things in this very general sense that your essence is that of a rational animal. But it's more, well, you actually can, say, form desires or communicate or whatever. Of course, one set of worries you might have is, well, what about like little babies who don't have any sense of self-awareness yet, or if we put you into a coma temporarily while you undergo surgery, like, well, now you can't do anything. Like, are we allowed to kill you before you wake up? So somebody sympathetic to that kind of view will have to have something to say about that kind of case. David Boonin, I think, has an interesting account where he thinks that the basis for the right to life is something like a dispositional, idealized desire to go on living. So there's kind of an occurrent versus dispositional desire distinction here. An occurrent desire is something that you might be, say, consciously aware of or thinking about, whereas a dispositional desire is something that you're maybe not consciously aware of or thinking about, but that maybe you would be under the right conditions or something like that, or it would manifest itself in action in some way or something like that. You maybe have not consciously thought about the fact that you want it to be the case that you don't get mooned by Donald Trump. But in fact, you don't want to get mooned by Donald Trump, right? If he walked in and started trying to moon you, you'd be like, whoa. So that's not an occurrent desire. You've never thought about it in your life, probably, but it's a dispositional desire.
Well, now I am. Thanks.
Yeah, right? It became an occurrent desire once I made it salient to you. And similarly, there's this distinction between actual and idealized desires. So your actual desires are just your actual desires. And then your idealized desires are something like the desires that, given your actual desires, you would have maybe if you were instrumentally rational or were fully informed or something like that. And he thinks, look, the basis for the right to life is an idealized dispositional desire. So you don't have to be consciously thinking about it, And you don't even necessarily have to have it. I mean, suppose you're depressed and are not thinking correctly, say. But if you were thinking correctly, you would realize that it was good for you to go on living. It's just that you don't right now, right? Well, in that case, we shouldn't kill you, of course. So the basis is this idealized dispositional desire, and he thinks that even babies can have this, and even sort of very late fetuses can have this. They have certain very simple desires, and were they able to consider the question of whether they wanted to go on living, then they would want to go on living in order to fulfill their very simple desires. So he thinks that, say, late fetuses have it, but not before 28, 30 weeks or something. So the vast majority of abortions are going to be okay on this view. I'm sort of sympathetic to a view according to which, I'm sympathetic to some sort of substance dualism. So I did a debate with Ben Watkins about dualism on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to the view that, look, what I am is a soul. It doesn't follow that the soul from the fact that I'm a soul, people who think that you're a soul, for some reason, tend to assume that ensoulment happens at conception, but historically, that's not always been the case. And in fact, that's not what everybody thinks now. Richard Swinburne, for instance, argues that, in fact, you don't have any reason to think that you're ensouled, that there's a soul connected to your body, until you have become conscious. And that doesn't happen until pretty late in pregnancy. Mm-hmm. So I'm sympathetic to something like that. Maybe I'm a soul, so that's what accounts for personal identity over time. The ensoulment probably doesn't happen until pretty late in the pregnancy, so there was no sort of self there before then. So there was no being with moral standing, on my view. And then there are other capacities that I develop that can sort of maybe strengthen the kind of prudential interest I have in continued life. Like, say, the capacity for this sort of Boonen-style capacity for, idealized dispositional desires to continue living and to do things in the future, stuff like that. So that's something like my view, or at least a view that I'm quite sympathetic to, is that one on which there is kind of a substance element that doesn't actually come into play until pretty late in pregnancy. But there are also other additional psychological elements that sort of help. Either they are part of what constitutes personhood. Maybe I wasn't really a person until I had the ability for these desires, say, or certain other capacities. Or at least they're a big part of what is morally important about paradigm people, right? So I don't know. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, that sounded good. And it kind of answered one of my future questions, too, of like, but we can talk a little bit more explicitly. Like, one of my next questions is like, okay, so then what are some reasons we have to think that personhood does not begin at conception? I think you covered some of that, but we can talk about that too. What I was going to say, it's funny with everything you said there about like the soul account. It was just kind of funny listening to that and realizing like how much kind of overlap there seems to be between your view on this as a substance dualist and mine as someone who's kind of sympathetic to like a kind of physicalism about minds. Not sure specifically what, but that's kind of where I lean. And I kind of agree because I generally like McMahon's view that like I'm not even identifiable with the organism that was a fetus, for like these first weeks until there was some sort of conscious activity. So this kind of psychological connectivity account and like, my personal, because again, this gets into also personal identity cases where it's like, well, I'm not, my personal identity has something to do with my brain. Obviously, if you take away my brain, I'm not going to be here anymore. I'm sorry, no matter what. And even substance dualists agree with that, I think. So there has to be some sort of like brain development. So obviously before my brain develops, I don't exist. So there's not. And Nobis and Grobe in their book on in responding to when they talk about these cases like futures, like future deprivation and stuff, they want to call into question the idea that fetuses even have futures like ours, because our futures, we have this psychological connection. But fetuses, it's a mindless non-conscious organism. So, and this is in philosophy of mind, it's pretty uncontroversial that consciousness is a sharp property. So there aren't like borderline cases of like, oh, this thing's kind of conscious but not really. There's either consciousness or there's not. So unless you're like a panpsychist, then you're going to have to say that at some point there is consciousness, but at some point there's not. And at the point in which there's not consciousness, then that's just not me. There's no way to make sense of that being me as a person. And that sounds like, pretty similar to your view, just without the soul, just using different language. And I know that's Swinburne's view. And the funny thing is, I'm pretty sure something like that is Aquinas's view. So this debate is a case where we can flip the table around and tell the Thomists they just haven't read enough Aquinas, right? Because we can.
Yeah, Thomas thought that you didn't get your rational soul until I don't know, like 1 or 2 months in, I think, something like that. Modern Thomists will say this is because he was using kind of old-timey science, and if he knew about modern embryology, then he would realize that ensoulment has to happen right away.
Yeah, but that doesn't seem to make sense. But
yeah, I think that if I were a physicalist, I would probably be attracted to something like the view you just described. So yeah, maybe my view doesn't really depend upon the soul stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Given that I believe in it anyway, it has a place in the overall view.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it works, and I know that is Swinburne's view, which has kind of caused some discomfort amongst Christian philosophers online a little bit, but hey, love Swinburne.
He does think that abortion is immoral for other reasons, but it's just because sort of God has commanded it for other reasons. He thinks it's not a form of murder.
Okay, yeah, no, this is just dealing with divine command theorists and applied ethics. I don't want to. We don't want to go down there.
Yeah, well, he's not a divine command.
I know, yeah.
He does think.
Yeah. I know he's not, but I was just thinking about that. I just had that thought creep in of like when you said that, I was like, oh man, that's rough. I don't even want to go down that road. So I think I wrote in my notes here for the question, why are alternative accounts of personhood lame? So that's the crude way of putting it. I mean, you touched on it a little bit, right? Like and McMahon has, if anybody's interested, again, I'm plugging McMahon a lot, but he has an extended discussion of hylomorphism in his book where he says it's pretty hard to tell how this view is even different from just kind of like materialism about persons, and it doesn't really seem to say much anything new or different. But it seems like we have to have an account of personhood. Like if our account of personhood is not in some way tied to consciousness or brain activity, it's going to have just really counterintuitive. So I guess one question, which we'll cover this is just kind of like a side point, we'll bracket off when we talk about animal rights, but do you think that, because I know Nobis's view is that a lot of animals are persons as well, and it seems pretty clear to us, intuitively, that it is wrong to kill animals in a lot of cases, but do we have to say things are persons to make it wrong for them to kill, or are there non-person things? It seems like there's also non-person things that we shouldn't kill. But of course, we're talking in this context, the dialectical context here is just about these kind of personhood objections to abortion. So we're not getting into it. But briefly, I'm kind of curious on this one. Do you think some animals are persons, or there's just some other feature of them as organisms that makes it bad to kill them?
Yeah. I guess, I don't know. I mean, I don't have strong views about whether some animals are persons. It's partly empirical and partly just because philosophically I don't have a very precise concept of exactly what you need to be able to do to be a person. But I do agree that there are probably lots of animals that it's wrong to kill without a good reason that are not persons. For maybe just sort of straightforward deprivation reasons. I mean, if the animal would have had a good life otherwise, then maybe it has some sort of agency. Maybe it doesn't have it's not future oriented in the way that we are, but it might have some sort of at least something like an idealized dispositional desire to keep going or something like that. I'm inclined to think that a chicken is probably not a person. I mean, it just doesn't do the sort of stuff that we think of people as doing. But it nonetheless has a kind of moral standing in virtue of being sentient and maybe in virtue of possessing a sort of very basic form of agency and so on.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. I got to chop my questions down here for time concerns, but there's so much to talk about. Did you want to say anything else about any other reasons to think that personhood probably doesn't begin at conception, or do you think we covered that? I mean, I think we said a lot about it. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say explicitly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have much more to add than we've already said.
Okay, yeah, I think we covered that pretty well too. So let's talk really quickly about a couple other little things here. got one more big one, of course, with the bodily autonomy cases, but just a couple things to go through. So we'll talk a little bit about Callum Miller's thought experiment, then we can talk briefly about your paper on Hendrix's argument. So just for the very basic version of Callum Miller's argument is like this uncertainty argument, and I'll give the basic idea, but you might have to clean it up a little bit. So the general idea is just like, if you're crash landed on a desert island, like there's a whole setup, but the basic thrust of the argument is that if your friend goes off to like find food and you guys are looking for food you're stranded on this desert island and you hear a rustling in the bushes and you go to shoot at it. You don't know if it's an animal. Like, you need food to eat, so it could be an animal, but your friend also went into the bushes, so you don't know. So there's this uncertainty. So you shouldn't kill this thing. You shouldn't shoot to kill because you don't know what it is. You don't know if it's going to be a good thing to kill it or if it's going to be killing your friends. So Callum Miller wants to say that this is, we can levy this as an argument against abortion. We can say, well, even if the fetus isn't a person, like maybe we just like don't know enough yet about personhood or consciousness or the science of it. And maybe like it's something else, or we don't know exactly what it is. There's this uncertainty element to the abortion cases. So just in the interest of being safe, call it, we shouldn't kill fetuses because maybe it's wrong to kill them. So I've seen a number of good responses to this, but what do you think about this one generally? And if you need to clean up my characterization there.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, this is a style of reasoning I've heard from other people too at different points. But yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I mean, there's something kind of, yeah. I mean, there's something somewhat plausible about the thought that you shouldn't do stuff that could be really bad unless you have some good reason for it, right? Even humor has a kind of parallel argument against eating meat. Like, look, even if you think that eating meat is probably permissible, even if there's like a 1% chance, like, the cost of giving up meat is so trivial, and eating meat, if it is wrong, is going to be so bad that you shouldn't do it, right? Particularly eating factory farm meat. Of course, people are inconsistent about where they want to apply this reason. Many pro-life people probably wouldn't accept that reasoning when it comes to, yeah. I mean, I guess this shows that, maybe just out of caution, you shouldn't get an abortion just to see what it's like or something. You shouldn't do it just trivially. But of course, exactly how much bite this style of reasoning has is going to depend on how likely it is that abortion is wrong and what the countervailing reasons are. You might think, at least in the case of, very early fetuses, I think that, I'm awfully confident that it's not seriously wrong. Even if it is wrong, you might think it's still not going to be nearly as wrong as killing an adult for the sorts of reasons that I mentioned earlier. It's not going to be nearly as bad. So even if they have some kind of moral standing, it's not quite going to be this. It's going to be a catastrophe in the same way. And the reasons you have for wanting an abortion might be quite weighty, right? I mean, it depends on your circumstances, but very weighty reasons having to do with bodily autonomy, having to do with the course of the rest of your life, blah, 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 blah. And so it'll depend a little bit maybe on how the calculus comes out, but I'm inclined to think that typically, at least in the cases of very early abortions where the person has some kind of appreciable reason for wanting an abortion, the sort of cautiousness reasoning is not going to undermine the thought that it's okay to get an abortion, even if it might, if you're getting an abortion for some totally trivial reason or something like that. Or, if you think there's a really high probability that abortion might be wrong or whatever.
Well, one thing I've thought about when I first heard this too was, especially given all the stuff we've already talked about previously, it seems like this is just not going to apply to some pro-choice arguments because, we're kind of trying to eliminate the uncertainty by giving a pretty rigorous and specific account of personhood and saying, with our best science, we know, conscience. Like, we know pretty much like when nervous system develops, but we also know because there's responses to stimuli. We know it's after that the neural systems even connect to the brain, so there's actual like harm being done. And then consciousness develops even later than that. So if we're giving this rigorous account of personhood as being really deeply tied in with consciousness and certain levels of brain activity, then we can say pretty definitively, like as our argument, that, this is not a person. So there's not an uncertainty there. And of course, they can question that assumption on the underlying metaphysics. But it seems like this argument to me, is not going to apply to at least some characterizations of the pro-choice view. Does that sound right? Or
I mean, I guess it's going to depend a little bit on, I mean, the example where you're shooting into the bush is one where there's empirical uncertainty. I'm uncertain what's behind the bush, right? I guess they might have to say this is a different sort of uncertainty where it's something like normative or moral uncertainty. Yeah, so given that your account of personhood or of the right to life or of the wrongness of killing or whatever is correct, maybe you can be sure that abortion is okay. But how sure are you about that, right? Isn't there some chance that your account of personhood is wrong and that the pro-lifers is correct and so on? There is a big philosophical question. I mean, one question is, well, how sure are you about, these other arguments that have tried to, your arguments for your own preferred view of personhood or whatever. Another question is about whether there's some sort of important asymmetry between empirical uncertainty and normative uncertainty, such that they can't be treated in the same way. And there's actually a very big philosophical literature about this that gets very technical, and people have different ideas about that. But
okay, yeah,
that's
fair enough.
Have to go.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. It's a good starter. Cool. So yeah, we talked about that one a little bit. So intuitive plausibility. So let's talk really quickly about another case that kind of sounds intuitively plausible that gets more problematic. And this is one I wanted to cover because you've written on it, actually. So again, as I said, I'll link all Dustin's stuff. So you want to check out. He has a couple papers on this, what's called the impairment argument against abortion. So I've read your papers. I'm pretty familiar, but you'll probably be able to give a better characterization. So you want to give kind of like the idea of what the argument is and what your response to it. And if you want, actually, funny enough, Dustin's paper that got published is his not as quite favorite response to the argument. So if you want to give your actually preferred response to the argument instead of your published one, that'd be great too. So,
yeah. So the impairment argument is this argument from Perry Hendricks that goes roughly something like, look, we all agree that it's wrong for you to drink very heavily during pregnancy and give your fetus fetal alcohol syndrome. But surely, if it's wrong for me to inflict an impairment of degree n upon you, then it's wrong for me to inflict an impairment of degree n+1 upon you, holding all else equal. But death is a much more severe impairment than fetal alcohol syndrome. And abortion results in the death of the fetus. So if it's wrong to inflict fetal alcohol syndrome on the fetus, then it must also be wrong to kill the fetus. So abortion is at least ceteris paribus wrong, right? At least all else equal between abortion and fetal alcohol syndrome. Inflicting fetal alcohol syndrome, abortion is wrong. Yeah, so I've defended a couple of responses to this. The one that I actually think is the stronger. I mean, this is the response that I accept. Well, I mean, I guess I accept both, but the response that I think is best, the impairment argument is explicitly not assuming that the fetus is a person, right? It's supposed to work whether or not the fetus is a person. Suppose that the fetus is not a person or is not a person at the point where most abortions are performed. Then it looks to me like there's a pretty clear disanalogy between abortion and inflicting fetal alcohol syndrome. Namely, if you get an abortion, what that does is prevent a person from coming into existence, right? Because the fetus doesn't survive to the point where it becomes a person. So in a way, it would be kind of like contraception, I suppose, right? You're just cutting things off before, or like abstinence, maybe. It would be cutting things off before the person comes into being. Whereas fetal alcohol syndrome allows, the fetus survives to become a person later on, but now they have this very severe impairment. So it inflicts a severe impairment on a person later who will come into being. It would be a little bit like maybe if I planted a landmine in the forest, knowing that later on some kid is going to walk along and get their leg blown off or something, right? I do something that's wrong because later on there's going to be a person who's going to have a complaint against me. So in the case where you get an abortion, there's no person with a complaint about you. The person never comes into being, just like they don't if you use contraception or if you don't have sex. Whereas in the case of fetal alcohol syndrome, the person does have a complaint against you because they come into being. Once they come into being, they have certain legitimate complaints, maybe about things you've done in the past that now cause them to have impairments. And so this is the big disanalogy. And Perry has a response to this sort of objection, basically that I think does not work. Perry's response, let me see if I can, it's been so long since I've thought hard about this because I wound up not publishing the paper, but I guess Perry's response is something like, but look, suppose you drank really heavily and gave your fetus fetal alcohol syndrome, and then you got into a car wreck and you miscarried. So there never was a person, right? You never gave birth. That would still be wrong, wouldn't it? And so that shows that it can't be the later effect on the person that makes fetal alcohol syndrome wrong. It's something about the impairment itself. And my response is that I think Perry is conflating what philosophers call objective and subjective wrongness. So objective wrongness is something like wrongness given the actual facts of the case. Subjective wrongness is something like wrongness given the information available to you. So if you ask me for a drink and I hand you a glass and the glass is full of poison and I don't know that, then that's subjectively all right because I didn't know that it was full of poison. Even if it's objectively wrong, I shouldn't have given it to you given that it was full of poison, right? And I want to say, in the case where you say drink heavily, not realizing that you're going to get into an accident and miscarry, for all you know, you are going to give birth to a kid and the kid's going to have fetal alcohol syndrome. That's subjectively wrong. And so you might still be blameworthy and so on because you didn't realize that the person wasn't going to come into existence. Even though objectively, maybe it turns out to be okay, due to the sort of moral luck on your part that you wound up not carrying the pregnancy to term. So that's the response that I defended in this paper that didn't get published. The response that I defended in the paper that did get published, and then Perry, I and Perry have gone, and Bruce Blackshaw have gone back and forth about this a little bit, relies a bit on Thompson's famous violinist argument. So Judith Jarvis Thompson has this famous argument. Look, the right to life is the right not to be killed. It's not necessarily the right to everything that you might need in order to avoid being killed or in order to avoid death. Suppose that someone, a violinist, is hooked up to you, and you're going to have to let this person, you're going to lay in bed, and this person's going to like use your kidneys or something through some kind of complicated dialysis machine for the next 9 months. You're hooked up against your will. This person, the violinist, is hooked up to you. Are you obligated, because of the fact that the violinist has a right to life, to stay hooked up to this machine for 9 months and let this guy use your body to survive? And Thompson thinks, no, of course not. My suggestion is roughly, look, the original argument employed a principle that had a ceteris paribus clause in it. It said all else being equal. If fetal alcohol syndrome is wrong, then abortion is wrong. But I say all else is not equal because women have much stronger reasons for wanting to get abortions than they typically do, or at least, I mean, outside of maybe addiction cases where moral responsibility is harder to assign and so on. I mean, at least I have stronger reasons to want to get an abortion maybe than I do for just wanting to like drink a whole lot during this period, right? And so the conclusion, I mean, nothing follows from the conclusion, because if the conclusion is abortion is ceteris paribus wrong, well, okay, but the ceteris paribus clause is not satisfied, right? So I suggest in this case, I mean, you might imagine a situation where you think, look, I could unplug from the violinist and I don't. I stay hooked up to the violinist for 9 months. And then an hour before I unplug, I down a liter of vodka, knowing that this will cause some kind of fetal alcohol syndrome-like impairment in the violinist, right? You might think it's plausible there to think, look, I didn't have to stay hooked up to the violinist at all. But given that I did, I can't then at the end drink a bunch of alcohol and inflict this, just because I want to, and inflict this serious impairment on them, right? And you can sort of see what the analogy here is going to be. It might be that you're not obligated to let the fetus stay hooked up to you at all, but if you are going to do that, then the additional effort that the additional demands on you of not drinking during that period are like a much smaller ask. It might be that the demandingness of staying hooked up in order to save the fetus's life doesn't obligate you, but the additional demandingness of not drinking in order to prevent the fetus having a debilitating impairment does obligate you, right? So did that make sense?
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, good stuff. That's interesting. Well, you touched on. I did want to ask next about like bodily autonomy cases. I think David Boonin has some new ones, but Thompson's is like, of course, like the most famous philosophy paper ever. But Dustin's paper where he gives that argument is appropriately called, I think it's Violinist, Demandingness, and the Impairment Argument Against Abortion is your first paper. Then he's got some replies as well, so check that out, description. But you gave a good characterization of it there. So you got the good idea. Now you can read the paper, and then I'm glad you got to give your favorite, your actually preferred response. It's a shame they didn't publish that one, but another time perhaps. But anyway, so when it comes to the bodily autonomy cases like Thompson's Violinist, we can take that one as like the example. If there's some others that you want to bring in, we can too. Yeah. But like, what do you think of those generally? It's kind of like, because we've been doing a lot of like defense so far. Like here's an account of personhood to undermine this, like undercut this premise you have against it. So, but here's where we go on pro-choice philosophers go on the offense a little bit by saying, okay, look, we have this like bodily autonomy. You have the right to do this. And I mean, it's worth pointing out too, Thompson's argument is compatible with not killing the fetus. She even says like it could be just like removed without killing it, like, but the woman still has the right to do that. So there's a lot there. What else was I going to say on this one? So there's that case, and one of the most popular. So I'm sure you're aware of some of the popular replies to this. You can go through those. I mean, one of the ones I hear from people initially is they kind of just like give this. They're like, oh well, there's a difference between killing and letting die. But despite whether or not that's true, because again, McMahon gives some reasons to think that there is no meaningful distinction there. But also we can think of, at least I think we can think of some bodily autonomy cases where you can actively kill to, preserve bodily autonomy. If you're like chained up by somebody in a cave for days on end and they come to give you food, you like stab them with this like makeshift shiv you've created. You're actively killing somebody, but that seems like it's within your rights to do to preserve your bodily autonomy, to not be chained up in a cave anymore. And there's also like a little bit of a legal support for these kinds of arguments, because there's like the famous McFall versus Schimpf case where this family member sued another family member of his over he needed like this life-saving surgery, but he needed like I think it was either bone marrow or some sort of body part, and so but the judge ruled that you can't demand somebody gives you like their organs to keep you alive, even if you're going to die. If they don't, you can't demand this even of family members, because that's something too people will say. They'll say, well, look, there's a morally relevant difference here, because like mothers and their children in terms of fetuses have this different kind of familial connection, such that this case is not similar to the violinist. But again, there's some legal background for thinking even with family cases that you're not like, if my brother comes to me and like tries to steal my kidney, I don't have to give him my kidney. It doesn't seem like. So there's kind of like a legal backing for this. So I'm curious as to what you think of the bodily autonomy cases in general. Do you think there are good arguments for the pro-choice view, and like, are there any other popular or like maybe better responses to them that are worth pointing out?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something to them at least. I do think they at least. Yeah, I mean, if you think about the court case where the guy didn't have to donate his bone marrow, I mean, you also wouldn't have to donate your bone marrow even if it was your own kid, right? Mm-hmm. So it does, regardless of the morality at issue, it does seem to suggest that maybe there's a kind of legal double standard. And Boonin has actually a new book about this, where it doesn't seem like there's any other case where people are required to let other people kind of depend on them, bodily in this way. Even in cases like the bone marrow case, where that would probably be a lot less demanding, actually.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, that does at least seem to me to show that there's some kind of legal inconsistency here. Either abortion should be legal, or, you actually should be able to demand that your parents give you a bone marrow transplant or whatever. They should be forced to do that legally. In terms of morality, I mean, I am sort of, I'm open to views on which morality might be much more demanding than lots of people think. So it's not quite as obvious to me as it is to some people that you can't unplug from the violinist. It might be that I would be willing to just say, in the literal violinist case, maybe you do just have to stay hooked up. And then, bodily autonomy on its own might not get you the pro-choice conclusion. Though one thing to say is lots of people don't think that you're required to stay hooked up. So regardless of what force the argument has for me, for these people, it seems like it has some bite for them, maybe. Another thing to say is, well, look, even if the fetus has some moral standing, you might think it still probably doesn't. And this is actually what Thompson thinks. Even if you think the fetus matters morally in some way, its death is probably still not going to be nearly as bad as the violinist's death. So this is sort of ceding some ground because it's not quite granting everything that Thompson wants to grant. But you might think bodily autonomy is a very important consideration. It might be enough actually to justify abortion, even if the fetus has some non-trivial moral standing, even if it wouldn't be enough to justify unplugging the violinist. So I guess those are sort of my two things. I mean, yeah, people do try to challenge the analogy in other ways. One is via this kind of killing, letting die distinction. Boonin has some good stuff on this. He has these arguments that are, I guess, really at their core supposed to try to show, I mean, technically you can perform abortions that are more like letting die. They're just sort of worse in various ways. They're more dangerous and so on. And he has these arguments that are sort of supposed to show that, like, look, if you could do the letting die thing, but it would sort of be worse for everybody involved, then surely you could kill, at least in that certain, even if there's some sort of distinction in general. This is a case where there's not an important distinction. There are kind of responsibility-based objections, I guess. Well, at least in the case of consensual sex, you knew that there was some chance that a kid would result. Boonin has a lot of stuff to say about that too. One important thing is, again, at least in the legal, when we come to the legal angle, I mean, again, you wouldn't have to donate bone marrow even to your own kid, even though you're responsible for their existence. I mean, it's an interesting argument. Bodily autonomy is certainly an important consideration. I'm not quite sure if I agree with everything Thompson says about it, but I think it might have some kind of force. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I love the like the risk argument that it's like, well, you took a risk, you knew. Nobis, the response they have in their book is something like, well, if I leave my front door unlocked, I know that it's technically metaphysically possible that a murderer walks through my front door, but like that doesn't mean I consent to somebody walking into my house and like eating my food or coming in. It's like, we do things all the time that have risk that we don't like, doesn't mean we consent to like these horrible consequences that are technically possible. So that one's just kind of sloppy.
Thompson says something, if I walk out on the street and I don't hire like a bunch of mercenaries to protect me, then that doesn't mean it's like my fault if I get mugged or something. Technically, there are things I could have done differently, but
that would have been way more demanding. Yeah, that's interesting. I do. Yes. Okay. So I think we've talked a lot about abortion. I did want to talk a little about like the potential persons, but because that's a popular one. But I think we can switch over to gun controls for time concerns. But we've covered a lot. This has been fun. Just the one final note. Aside from your writing so far, what would you recommend to people as kind of like a good step to become like philosophically informed on the pro-choice view? Because it seems like people's on both sides kind of tend to have this sort of this ideological commitment to one. So as far as I guess recommended reading, do you have any suggestions for resources for people on this topic?
Yeah. I would say Boonen's books are very good. Um, so those are probably the thing where I would direct people to first.
Okay.
He has the older book that's about the morality of abortion, and then a newer book about the legality of abortion.
The Beyond Roe one is the new one, right? And then the old one is just the defense of abortion. Okay. Yeah. Boonen is referenced a lot, so he's very good. So yeah, no, so he has a book called The Defense of Abortion, he has a Beyond Roe, then he has like a really recent book on the non-identity problem and ethics of future people, published by Oxford, so talking about some like parfit cases and everything. So yeah, no, I second that recommendation. Boonen's great. And as I said earlier, McMahon as well. And then, of course, Nathan Nobis's video and Nathan Nobis's book, and by extension, my video. So, hey, self-plug here. But okay, so that's all good stuff. We covered a lot of that. I should never be worried about, timing concerns. There's so much to talk about with this. There is the issue with abortion of like whether or not we'll even be able to make progress on it, given people's different underlying assumptions about metaphysics and normativity. But yeah, there's more to say there. But for time concerned, let's move on to gun control. So this is another really prominent ethical case, applied ethics, especially in the United States. I mean, as with a lot of issues, it's kind of like the rest of the world has sort of figured it out, but the United States is like, no, they're sort of kind of against the grain in terms of most industrial countries have, pretty sort of moderate gun control and less gun homicides, surprise, surprise. But so let's talk a little bit about, again, we'll talk about it generally, but then I do want to spend most of the discussion on your paper, because I think your paper is actually dealing with like probably one of the most important arguments for gun rights, and then kind of a good response to it. But to start off with, let's do the same thing in terms of defining gun control. So this is one where if anybody is interested in this, there's a whole book written by an ethicist, Hugh LaFollette. He has a book recently called In Defense of Gun Control. I believe it's published by Oxford. Yeah, and so he distinguishes between like the three kind of levels of gun control. Because when people in America hear it, they kind of have these like, scary visions of like, the state coming in and the SWAT teams kicking down your door and taking all your guns. And so there are advocates for total gun control, like, nobody owns them, nobody does anything. But that's not, when we talk about gun control, there are a lot more like moderate steps. So there are different views. So, the one way LaFollette puts it is in his, not in his book, because I haven't read all this book, but just his paper on gun control, like an introduction to it. He says, like, kind of the central question on this is, who can own which guns and under what conditions? That's kind of like the central question. So there's kind of there's sort of like a spectrum of these views. So you can, believe in like gun control, but not be like total state confiscation. So how do you like to characterize defining gun control?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable enough. It might depend a little bit on what goes into the what conditions condition, because there are some things that you might consider gun control that are not so much about whether you're allowed to own a gun, but about, say, storing it safely or registering it with such and such an agency or whatever. Things that are about what you have to do once you do have a gun. So not all. At least for some kind of popular sense of the term gun control, not all gun control measure, or requiring people to get safety training, or there are some things that might be called gun control that are not really about restricting gun ownership quite so much as just trying to make it safe, something like that. I think that's reasonable enough. Broadly speaking, it's regulation of guns, regulation of firearms. All of these rules that are supposed to either restrict ownership or, make it safer in various ways or whatever.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right. So because like LaFollette in his book, he includes in the umbrella of gun control even just having like more regulations on buying guns, whether you more he includes in that definition like having more extensive background checks, like maybe requiring licensing. So not even necessarily restricting guns or types of guns, but just restricting the conditions under which people can own them. So I think that's included because some people that are gun control advocates are fine with you owning like an AR-15. They just think you should have to go through like an extensive background check. You shouldn't be able to just go buy it at a gun show and not have to register it. Like it should be at least registered with the state or some organization in some extent. So So there's a broad range. When we're arguing for or against gun control, there's going to be a lot of different things. So let's see. I get when we talk about your paper, we'll talk about your preferred kind of definition and preferred proposal, I guess, for gun control. I mean, a lot of people I think are pretty open to, they're sympathetic to the idea. Like, it does make sense that we should have, we should be careful about who we let own guns, unless you're Mike Humer and you're like an anarcho-capitalist and you're like, whoever owns, everybody should just own whatever weapons. Which brings me to our first argument. Dustin, it seems pretty simple, right? Guns don't kill people, man. I'm sorry, they just don't. People kill people. Guns don't do anything. They're just objects, dude. So how can you restrict objects? I mean, the NRA likes to say this one. A lot of libertarians like to say this one. I mean, it's simple, right? Guns don't kill people. So what's this all about?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know what is even the argument there. There's this Canadian comedian called John LaJoie. And back when I was in high school, he had a bunch of parody songs he released on YouTube. I guess the conceit was that he was like a very bad white rapper in these songs, and there's one called "I Kill People," where
I've seen this. Yeah,
the refrain is "Guns don't kill people. I kill people with guns."
With guns, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, yeah, I mean, I guess guns don't kill people on their own, but I mean, unless sometimes they do, I suppose, when they're accidental discharges and stuff. But I mean, people kill people with guns, but what's supposed to follow from that? I mean,
yeah,
this would be equally good as an argument for civilian nuclear weapon ownership, or
yeah.
What we care about is something like, in some very broad sense, the effects of people owning guns. Respecting people's rights, blah, 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 blah. Not whether the guns themselves are morally responsible agents who are, to be blamed for the killing or whatever. So.
Yeah. La Follette says this too. He says the same thing in his paper. There's also a current affairs article called "What Kills People," and they're and so La Follette makes the same point. It's like, imagine somebody saying nuclear weapons don't kill people. People do. And so it's like, that's pretty...
I didn't realize I was, guess great minds.
Yeah, I think because La Follette said it, and then the current affairs article, Nathan Robinson said it, and everybody has this kind of like we could just say that about anything, right? Technically, it's just it's obviously there's intentional agents, but of course the capacity to kill is way greater. But along those lines, and maybe a little more serious note, people will point to examples in China, or that happens in a lot of places, like knife attacks or trucks. There was the one case a year or so ago where a guy, I forget, it might have been in France, where he drove a huge truck through a crowd and killed 80 people. There's a compilation somebody, some pro-gun person, put together of all these knife attacks in China where 10 or more people were killed in these mass stabbings. So a little more serious along this line, people say, well, sure, guns do increase our capacity for killing people, but so do all these other things we have in society. There's pretty common use. We can't restrict people owning cars, but obviously cars have the capacity, if you so choose, to kill a lot of people. Same with knives. So kind of in the same vein of this argument, people will say, look, guns aren't hurting anybody unless somebody chooses to use them. But we say the same thing for a truck that you could drive through a crowd, or a knife. So if we're not going to ban every inanimate object that can be used to kill a lot of people, then why would we ban guns? Now, of course, the very simple is cars are necessary for functioning in everyday society, and guns are not. Same with knives in some senses. If you work any kind of retail or a warehouse job, you might need a knife to cut open a box. You don't need a gun for any kind of everyday activity. So there's that basic point. But do you have anything you want to say to those cases where people are just well, you should want to ban cars too, because you can use a lot of things to kill people? Or another one is, people will point out, in the United States, most homicides are carried out with hammers. And so they'll be well, we can't restrict. And again, same thing applies. You need a hammer to work. You don't need an AR-15. But I've seen. I don't think it's true in terms of most. Some people will say that it's not actually a true statistic. Right. There are a good number of homicides with hammers, but it's not. I don't know that it's the majority. It's just something people. One of those people post online, and you're always I'm pretty sure that's not true. But even if it is,
Yeah.
So aside from the kind of like everyday use, do you have any other like lines of reply to this?
Yeah. So
That
I
you like?
mean, yeah, I guess there are two things. One is whether something should be banned depends partly on the risks and also partly on the utility, right? Of
Hmm.
course, you can't really ban motor vehicles, at least given the way our society is structured. Um, the utility of guns is obviously much less. Even if you are like if somebody really loves guns, the utility of guns is much less than the utility of motor vehicles. Um, Knives, of course, it would be impossible to ban, just practically speaking, because it's just a sharp piece of metal. You know, what are you making it? The second, I mean, yeah, maybe there are two more things to say. One is that even though there are other available means in some circumstances, obviously guns do increase lethal capacity in lots of other circumstances. I mean, it just sort of, I mean, just intuitively, if you knew that somebody was going to try to go on a killing spree, like, would you rather they had a semi-automatic rifle or a box cutter? Like, I mean, yeah, they might hurt some people with the box cutter too, but just playing the odds here, like, probably going to be fewer. Um, Another point to make, I think, is that really a big part of the case against widespread firearm ownership is not even about homicide so much as about suicide. At least I think. I mean, we know that firearm ownership, having guns in your home. Whoops, you there?
Sorry, yeah, nope, I got an Amber Alert. That's great. I've never had that one happen before in the middle of this, so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, basically, there are good reasons, both sort of theoretically, to expect this, and it bears out when you look at the data. There are good reasons to think that higher firearm ownership correlates with an increased suicide rate for a number of reasons, namely, including the fact that guns are much easier to use than other suicide methods. If you're suicidal, you may not have very much initiative. It's often very impulsive, so something that takes longer to set up or takes more effort to set up, you might change your mind. They're much more lethal. Most people who attempt suicide once never try to commit suicide again. The vast majority do not die by suicide if they survive their first attempt. So if you use a very lethal method like a gun for your first attempt, then your chance of dying by suicide is much higher, etc. So there are something like 20,000 gun suicides in the U.S. every year, I think, 20-some thousand, which is about much more than the number of firearm homicides. It's actually much more than the number of homicides, period. It's plausible to think that a lot of those wouldn't happen if not for firearm ownership. And it's plausible to think that in many cases, if the person didn't die by suicide at that point, then they would have recovered from whatever the problem was and gone on to live their life and done fine, just like most people who survive a suicide attempt do. Eventually, they recover from whatever they were going through, and they live their life and they're fine, and they don't want to commit suicide anymore, right? So there's also sort of a big public health issue around suicide that's directly connected to firearm ownership, and I don't think that there's any analogous argument with this other stuff there.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, the empirical data on this one is really important. So I've read a couple things. There's, again, I don't know if anybody watching, if you're familiar with there's a podcast called Science Versus, and they have a whole episode on gun control and like gun regulations and comparative by countries, and they talk about the suicide rates, and they talk about some really bad scholarship that's been done on this. Like there was a book, I think the author's name was Lott. It was called like More Guns, Less Crime. And there's some figures people have on gun violence, like the deaths, that is just like the science on like the multiplication rate for those is like so horribly done. So they go through, it's helpful because they go through some popular science that's very badly done, but they also talk about, so there's a couple things, like for one thing, like to support your point, I think it was the Israeli military, they saw like a 40% decrease in suicides amongst their military members when they restricted them from taking guns home on leave. Because, of course, if you're in the military, you're going to have, especially in like a place like Israel, you might have like, psychological problems that may lead to mental health issues. So they saw like a big drop in suicides when they stopped people from taking guns home. There's also the case, McMahon talks about these cases too, of like, obviously like a gun is a more appealing method to suicide, and you might be more willing to try that than like say slitting your wrists or jumping off a bridge or something. So, and as you say, that people tend to recover from this. So there are a lot of, and there's of course figures about accidental deaths, and there's all sorts of empirical data on this that gets really important. So that's good to talk about with the, I've seen, and so that's all helpful with the example of cars and knives. And you're right. Oh, and there was also some of the other science that was talked about is people are also more likely to recover from knife wounds. So there have been like knife attacks, and people recover from stab and slash wounds, especially slash wounds, because those don't, usually go too deep and pierce like vital organs. So as long as you stop blood loss, you're going to be okay a lot of times. So there's been also data on people recover at a much greater rate from being attacked with knives than they do from being shot with guns, because the bullets are a lot more destructive to like internal organs. So there's also some data on that. So there's a lot of science here that's really important. So there was another, for people, anybody who reads The Federalist, which I wouldn't recommend, that there was an article, I think Timothy Shao published it, and it was about like how gun control advocates should also be advocating for banning alcohol and tobacco, because there's a lot more deaths from alcohol and tobacco abuse every year than there are from gun violence. So the main figure for this is like, something like 480,000 people die a year in the United States from smoking, from, tobacco. So, we should, if we're going to ban guns because of these deaths that result in it, then we should also want to ban these things. Now, of course, there's also there's the straightforward issue here of smoking and drinking are like choices that affect your body and you personally, whereas, a gun has a capacity to kill a lot of other people. So there's the capacity for death rate. But there's also, we have talked about suicide with guns. So, this seems like a pretty straightforwardly like bad analogy to me. But what, do you have anything you want to say about that one too? Like, why should gun control advocates not be like, are gun control advocates committed to saying we should ban any of these risky substances?
No, partly for the reasons you've suggested. I guess people should. I guess gun control advocates should be in favor of. Attempts to reduce substance abuse in general, just like anybody else.
Yeah.
And of course, there are also, even if you wanted some sort of prohibition, we know empirically that alcohol,
that's not a good idea.
Yeah, didn't really work. Seems like, at least based on the experience of other developed nations, there are kind of reasonably effective gun control measures that when they do. So. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was something that I saw the other day, and I was like, we take like 30 seconds to talk about this one. Yeah. So on the issue, well, I think I'll just flag that for when we talk about the later case. Most of the discussion I want to talk, as I said, about like the rights-based argument. So we'll avoid the Second Amendment stuff because, again, Current Affairs has a good article on that. Where people are just like, well, it's a Second Amendment right, and it's. I love Chomsky has a video on this. He's like, look at what the founders want us to have guns for. It was suppressing slave rebellions and killing Native Americans. Like, we don't really want to appeal to the founders' intentions for gun rights. But some people do that. So we'll talk about the serious arguments for that when we talk about Fumer's paper. But really quickly. Ooh, what was the other thing I said? Hang on, let me find my notes here. Okay, so here's a really common one. So it goes along a lot of times with the Second Amendment argument. People say, all right, well, they say, here's why the founders want us to have guns. And whether or not that's true, whatever. But just take the argument at face value. They say, we need guns so that in case the state gets way too oppressive or, like really restrictive or tyrannical, like we want to be able to fight back against the state and take the fight to them, be able to hold our own against the government. And overthrow it if we need to. That's just like Thomas Jefferson and Jesus intended. We need to be able to use our guns to fight the government. So, this one's pretty straightforwardly not great. But what do you think about that one? Chomsky's also had in the same video. He was like, yeah, this is a deluded fantasy to think you'd be able to actually fight the state with your pea shooters. But what do you think about this argument? People that say now, so okay, I do want to hear your thoughts on that one generally, but I don't take that argument at that face value very seriously for a lot of empirical reasons. Like you're not gonna be able to fight drones and bombs with your AR-15s. But I want to hear your response to that. But the more serious version, I think, of this, and one that I do struggle with on occasion with gun control measures, is should we really be asking people to trust the police to be the only ones in society with guns? And the more serious problem with this, I think, is asking minority groups to to trust the police to be the only ones with guns, because we've seen, especially recently, but we've seen it for a while, just terrible systemic police oppression of minority groups. This is why the Black Panthers armed themselves as a means of resistance towards the state, and why Reagan pushed gun bans. So we have seen minority groups that have armed themselves as a means of resisting, kind of oppression by agents of the state. So this is the version of it that I kind of think is actually kind of like maybe a little bit of a serious problem that's worth addressing. Is it really fair to ask people, say in the Black community, to give up, any of your means of self-defense and trust the police to protect you, when it's the very police that, in a lot of cases, are actually brutalizing them violently? And so we really want to, trust the police to be the only ones with at least high capacity firearms. So I guess we can do that in order, like take the less serious version first, and then the more serious version of like, is it really fair to ask people to trust the government this much? So what do you think of those cases?
Yeah. So I actually have a paper under review right now that's about some of these issues.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the general, you're going to rebel against a tyrannical government type thing. Yeah, I mean, what to say about that? I guess it's true. I mean, maybe people are a little unfairly dismissive, because of course it's true that a bunch of guys with hunting rifles or whatever are not going to be able to shoot down drones and stuff. But of course you can cause lots of trouble. You might be able to get enough leverage against the government, even if you can't overthrow it in a war. You might be able to cause enough trouble that that could give you some sort of political whatever. I think at least two things to say. One is that, at least in general, we know that sort of nonviolent civil resistance is actually a better way of bringing about political change than is violent revolution. I mean, there might be exceptions to that, but there's a very good book by two sociologists called Why Civil Resistance Works, which shows that actually, movements that focus on not means other than violent revolution, both are more likely to achieve regime change or to achieve other concessions, and are more likely to sort of have better results afterwards. If you do depose the government, then you're more likely to install a new functional democracy afterwards. And there are a lot of reasons why this is. Another thing I think is just, and of course this is a partisan response, but if you look at the people who have the most guns in the U.S., like, are you so sure that they're going to be fighting against the tyrannical government? I mean, to the extent that people sort of armed yahoos with guns can exert some sort of leverage over the government, it's not clear that that's good for democracy. It might be pretty bad when you look at the track record of armed yahoos with guns in the U.S. over the past few decades.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so I mean, that's one thing to say about that. Another thing, I mean, so the argument about minority communities is more serious, I think, and there's some good historical work which actually argues that the people in the civil rights movement being armed, not engaging in offensive revolutionary violence, but being armed against people who would come and try to terrorize them and kill them and so on, that actually was like a major contributor to the civil rights movement being successful. It would have been a lot harder to keep the movement together without these ways of defending yourself against terroristic violence. Actually, there are lots of examples of people successfully defending themselves against Klansmen and so on. After a bit, the Klansmen would stop because if you get your nose bloodied or whatever. But I mean, so I think that this is a more serious argument. It's less clear to me that it actually justifies lax gun control policies in light of the fact that, again, there are all these other bad consequences from guns, and like the fact that, again, People on the other side can have guns in light of the fact that the prevalence of guns, I mean, in the case of police shootings and so on, the prevalence of guns is one of the main justifications for the use of police violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I mean, I think that there might be some, not wild argument, some credible argument for the thought that under a regime that does have lax gun control laws like the U.S. does, maybe sort of armed self-defense groups like, say, the Black Panthers or the Deacons for Defense of Justice back in the day, or today, like the John Brown Gun Club, or the National African American Gun Association, or the Pink Pistols, this LGBT self-defense group. There might be some sort of argument for what they're doing. And you would want, if you wanted to, and I mean, this is very tricky. I mean, you don't want to say something because the stakes are so high here. You don't want to say something that cause problems, right? I think that, and I mean, I don't actually know to the extent to which they do this in practice. You would want them to, try to get people to be safe and maybe not keep guns in their homes unless they really need to and stuff to reduce it. Do things to reduce the risks of suicide and accidents and so on. Do things to reduce the risks that come with gun ownership. But yeah, maybe there's some argument there for kind of, community self-defense organizations and that sort of thing to have guns under sort of very non-ideal conditions like those in which we find ourselves. I think that's sort of the best kind of broadly, maybe, or one of the best sort of broadly pro-gun arguments.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's probably is the best because it's like, even if it's going to be on average better, it is hard to like ask these communities being brutalized by people in power to trust those people in power to be the only ones with weapons. Like that doesn't seem fair. But the points about civil resistance and all that is a good point. Because you think about some of the the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening now. I mean, we saw the police are very willing to brutalize people even though they're peacefully protesting all over the country. So imagine if they had guns. I mean, that just gives them a green light to start shooting. And so things could have ended up being a lot worse in the long run. But that one's definitely tricky. I think this is probably the trickiest one for me on this one as well.
In the civil rights movement, a commitment to civil resistance as a tool of political change coexisted with and was facilitated by a commitment to armed self-defense, right? The political work was made possible partly through a willingness to fight back against people who were trying to murder you.
Right.
So, but.
Yeah, that's true. All right. I kind of want to, so we can skip ahead now to the paper because that covers a lot of like 4 or 5 questions are all contained with that. I'll just flag, there's one thing that comes up too. People just say like, well, I want guns so I can hunt or target shoot. And McMahon has a couple of good responses. I mean, for the target shooting one, it's of course, it could very obviously be the case that, like gun ranges kept guns on their premises very very well contained so that you can just go there and use them to shoot targets, then leave.
I think they often do, even now, actually. Yeah, you don't.
Yeah. Like I've been to a couple gun ranges and so some of them, like the outdoor ones, especially, you can bring your guns. Others, you go and you can just like rent. So there's no reason to think that if your purpose for using a gun is purely recreative for target practice, then you could very easily make that work under which conditions in which you don't have to privately own guns. The hunting example, it doesn't, again, because we talked about there are tiers of gun control. So a lot of gun control advocates don't necessarily have problems with like bolt action rifles that you would use for hunting. Some do, but but a lot of times we're talking about like semi-automatic weapons or I think there's a lot higher killing capacity. If you have a rifle like one of mine that only holds five shots and it's a bolt action, that's not, a lot of people don't have like huge problems with that because that's not going to be super dangerous. And you don't need handguns for hunting, and most homicides with guns are carried out with handguns. It seems like there's good science on that. So the hunting cases, it doesn't really apply much to these. So I just wanted to, we won't talk about those too much with other responses, but just as a flag, those aren't super good arguments either. So let's move on to talk about kind of probably the second best, other than the one we just talked about, the second best or one of the best arguments for gun rights. And this kind of, it's more of a family of arguments, but the specific one Humor gives about like the right to self-defense and like, taking, so there's the very kind of like basic example of this Humor gives where it's like, well, taking away somebody's gun is like taking away someone's gun right before they're attacked, or like, and then you just kind of like, so you've kind of directly enabled their attacker to kill them easier. And McMahon talks about this one, like, this is not really a good analogy because we're not saying, society, there should be no mechanisms for protection. And also, there's also the instance of a lot of, mass access to guns makes guns easier to get. So criminals would be harder for them to get guns too with gun control measures. But McMahon also talks about this isn't analogous because we do want to advocate for having protective forces like the police. So it's not like you're removing the only access to safety as people have. But so this general rights-based argument that people like to give, that you're depriving people in a serious way from a kind of a fundamental or even derivative right they have to protect themselves, and so the benefits of gun control are going to have to be like massive in order to make it okay to violate this prima facie right. And there are other concerns that come into play here about like the McMahon case and the humor response, and then your kind of updated response of whether or not it's true that people are generally safer in societies with less guns, and how this relates to individual safety. Because humor gives this account of like, well, what if we're just concerned with individual safety? It may be the case that society overall is safer, but there are individual cases where people are made like drastically less safe in really morally important ways. So there's a lot to pick through here. So I don't know if you want to give kind of like your general, like the general kind of what the debate is here and what you think about it.
Yeah. So I guess, I mean, here's the basic thought behind humor's argument. Look, people have certain rights. And perhaps these rights can be, at least when it's a very important right, perhaps these rights can be overridden by considerations about consequences in some circumstances. But you can't violate somebody's right just because it will be slightly better. There has to be like a really big difference in consequences, right? I couldn't kill you just because I think it will save 1.1 statistical lives, say. Maybe that's a little bit better in expectation, but I'm violating your right, and violating your right can't be justified by that very minor. Maybe I could kill you to save a much larger number of people. Hard to know what that number would be, 5, 10, 100, 1 million, but at some point when there are enough other people on the line, then maybe I can kill you, but not just to do slightly more good than I've done harm, right? And humor thinks, look, if you implement at least some sort of very restrictive gun control policy. Now he's thinking about like a gun ban, like a total gun ban, which of course many gun control policies are much milder. I mean, in fact, nobody is even really defending something quite that drastic, but he thinks, I guess it could be, you could kind of extrapolate from there.
Yeah.
But, I mean, suppose you're going to ban all the guns, and you think that this will save lives on balance. This will reduce the overall amount of crime, of homicides and so on. It will still be the case that some people will die as a result of you doing that. There will be some people who will be murdered who could have defended themselves if they had a gun. But now they can't defend themselves because you took their gun away. And that's a violation of their right to self-defense. Just as surely as if somebody was about to murder you, and you pull out a gun to defend yourself, and I take it away, and then you get murdered. I've violated your right to self-defense, right, by denying you the best or the only available means of defending yourself. And that is almost as bad as murdering you myself, right? If I yank the gun out of your hand right when you're about to get murdered. That's not really any better than if I, say, held you down while the other guy stabbed you. And that's not really any better than if I stabbed myself. Okay. And so humor thinks, when you implement the gun control policy, it's as if you're murdering a bunch of people, really, in order to achieve this overall better result. And again, maybe that could be justified if the result was going to be much greater, many times as much good as the harm you've done. But it won't be justified if you've just done like a little bit more good. And so what this does is show that the proponent of at least really strict gun control can't just show that this will save lives on balance. They need to show that it will save many, many, many times as many lives as it will cost. And humor thinks that it's implausible that they're going to be able to do that. Okay. What McMahon says is, look, though, you're making everybody safer in expectation, right? You're reducing the risk to everybody. And reducing the risk to everybody is justifiable, even if it means that different people are going to die, right? This is my example, not his, but I mean, suppose that, due to climate change, a bunch of big storms are going to sweep through in the future and kill a lot of people. But you can implement policies now that will reduce how severe these storms are, and they're going to kill fewer people. But they might be different because the storms will happen in different places or something in some way we can't predict. So different people will die, but everybody's made safer on balance. Then McMahon thinks, that's going to be okay. And the gun control policy is similar. That makes everybody safer on balance. And Humer says, it does not make everybody safer. Because suppose, for instance, that you're some particular person who is especially at risk for some reason. Maybe you have an abusive spouse or something. Maybe you know that the police won't get there in time if you're attacked, something like this. In this case, you will be made, you'll be put in greater danger by the gun control policy. So it makes people safer on average, maybe, but it doesn't make each individual person safer. This is where Philip and I come in. And we draw on this work by Caspar Hare. So Caspar Hare has these arguments for the claim that in situations where you are going to do something that will cause some people to die and will save more people, but based on the information available to you, everyone's chance of surviving is increased by this course of action. So it's what you would do if you were just motivated by beneficence for each person, given the information available to you. That course of action is permissible. So Caspar Hare has these cases where there are these increasingly convoluted trolley problems.
Oh, yeah.
Where we presented this paper at the American Philosophical Association once, and afterwards somebody came up and they had gone to the talk and then heard us start giving these trolley cases, and they were like, and then I was like, this is one of those papers. Caspar Hare has these cases where suppose this is the analog of pushing the fat man in the trolley case. So I have to push one person off the bridge in order to save 5 who are down on the track. But lo and behold, everybody is in a suitcase. They're in like a big old-timey steamer trunk or something. So I don't know who is where. So can I do this? I'm going to kill one person and I'm going to save 5. But I don't know which person I'm going to kill. And so each person's chance, and as far as I know, they're randomly distributed. So each person's chance of survival, if I push, is 5/6, based on the information available to me. And each person's chance of survival is only 1/6 if I don't push, even though in fact one person will die if I push who would have survived otherwise, right? And Hare's thought is that in this case, it's permissible for me to push. I think about Micah. I know that you're in one of the suitcases, and I think, what should I do for, insofar as I'm concerned about Micah? And I think pushing gives Micah a 5/6 chance of survival. I should push. And then I think about Joe, and I think, pushing gives Joe a 5/6, and I keep going down the line, and so I should push because what I've done is reasonably beneficent towards each individual person. And he has these sort of increasingly convoluted trolley cases that are supposed to motivate you. If you don't initially agree with that, suppose there are 6 tracks, and I know that each track, it's a similar setup. One suitcase and then up on the bridge, and 5 suitcases on the tracks. And I know that there's one person on each track, either in the suitcase or on the tracks. But I don't know where they are. and I know that for one of the tracks, the person is in the suitcase that I'm going to push, so I'll kill them. But for the other 5, they're on one of the 5 tracks that are or one of the 5 suitcases that are on the track, right? So now I come and I say, I know that Micah is on this track. So now you're the only person affected by my action. And I think, look, if I push, there's a 1/6 chance that I kill Micah, a 5/6 chance that I save Micah. So I've got to do it.
Yeah, you just got to do it. Yeah.
And of course, I should reason the same way for each track. And then there's a further argument he gives that, well, when we merge them all into just one case, you should behave in the same way, right? So anyway, it's a very wild paper.
Yeah.
It's very, very clever. Casper Hare is very smart. But anyway, so yeah, you're permitted to act in ways that are reasonably beneficent, that increase expectations for everybody, even if they'll hurt some people, in fact. Our argument is, look, if the government realizes that you're going to be put at special risk, you're a law-abiding citizen who's going to be put at special risk if we deny you a gun, well, then of course the government should give you a gun. You have an abusive spouse and you need a gun, an abusive ex-spouse, you need a gun, whatever. Well, then of course, you can make exceptions. And in fact, there are these restrictive licensing regimes that attempt to do this, right? So when the government can tell that you are going to be put at risk, then yeah, okay, give you a gun, that's fine. What about the broader population of people for which we can't tell who in particular is going to be put at risk? All we know is that some people are going to be harmed if we implement the policy and more will be saved. In that case, we argue, okay, this looks analogous to the pushing the suitcases case. Now we're in a situation where I don't know. I know some people will be hurt by the policy. I know that more people will be helped. I don't know who's who, and so it looks like each individual person's chance of being saved is greater if I implement the policy. And so that demonstrates proper concern and respect for each individual person, even though unfortunately some people who would have otherwise been okay will be harmed as a result. And so we, that's the basic move. There are more cases that we give. One, I forget even what the point is. One of them involves switching around weapons on trolleys that are going to different people. It's a very wild paper. I recommend it. It's available open access on Ergo's website. Everybody should go read it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I read it this morning, so I had a good background. I was prepared.
So basically, I guess the short version is we argue that when the government knows somebody will be put at special risk, you can have a restrictive licensing regime and let them have a gun. When the government doesn't, then we're in one of these situations where you increase everybody's chance of survival, even if, relative to your information, even if in fact some people will be made less safe. And so that's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I really like that reply. It's interesting because I remember reading about this a little bit and intuitively finding like what McMahon said pretty plausible. I was like, oh, okay. And then I talked to you about it. And you're like, nah, humor got him on that point, but we kind of fixed it. And I was like, all right, let me. So I read up on it. And I found myself agreeing with you. Like the general idea is right, but it kind of has to be. It's got to escape these cases in a certain way. I wonder though, for like humor's example and like maybe like another route of reply. What about if we were just going to talk about like for the cases where people like especially need it for self-defense, what about just like non-lethal methods of self-defense? I mean, what if we like allow people to have things like mace or high power, high capacity tasers, or even guns that shoot rubber bullets of some sort that are like incapacitory, or going like Assassin's Creed here, like tranquilizing darts or something. Like aren't there a lot of other ways we could provide people with means of self-defense against an aggressor, like say an abusive spouse who's drunk and unarmed and just like trying to like punch you or hit you with a beer bottle? I mean, if you have a really high-powered taser that's not going to kill this person, but obviously incapacitate them until you can call the police, why not just be fine with people owning those things but still restrict gun access? Like, can't you still guns aren't the only means of self-defense. And I think some other philosophers have made this point. I'm not sure exactly where I read it, but what do you think about that as another route of reply?
Yeah, it'll depend a bit on the empirical facts, I guess. Mm-hmm. If these other means are really as good as guns, then I think that would sort of settle the case. Well, okay, you don't have any reason to prefer a gun over, this non-lethal means, and so what's the problem here? Just get the non-lethal means. I guess my inclination is to think there probably are going to be just empirically situations where a gun actually would be more effective. And so then the non-lethal means, it might still be better to have it, but it won't be a complete substitute for the firearm in terms of self-defense. And if that's right, then you might still be able to get some sort of humoresque worry off the ground.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds right. Well, I think the solution is obvious, just state-mandated martial arts training, just everybody should be forced to learn expert level Krav Maga, and we'd all be fine. No need for guns. We just duke it out in the streets. So, so that's the obvious answer. But, if you don't want to go with that one, then fine. Your paper's pretty good, I guess, Oh, man. Okay, that's all great. I think that's most of the questions I had on guns, things on do guns make a society, as a whole more safe, and it's, are guns would banning guns make people less, more safe on average? And there are some reasons to think in a certain restricted sense. Yeah, okay, that's all really good. Well, we were going to talk a little bit about animal ethics, but we're about 2 hours here, so we can cut that off. I mean, I'd say, huh?
Yeah, I was going to say we might already be going about as long as the video should be. So
yeah, well, longer even. I remember we before talking, I was like, yeah, we'll probably get through these 3 things, and then we'll be at an hour and a half, and we can go from there. And here we are at 2 hours on the first 2. But luckily, if you guys do want to hear Dustin talk about animal ethics, he has a previous interview for Brain in Nevada, I believe it was, that was really good, where he gives a really interesting argument from Alistair Norcross, who's a really big person in terms of animal ethics. So you can listen if you want to listen to Dustin talk about animal ethics. You can do that for over an hour on that. So I'll link that one in the description as well. All the Dustin you can get for and our previous videos. So that'll be great. And I'm looking forward to when Joe's video drops too. I don't think it's been released yet, but keep an eye out for that. I'm sure most people here also watch Joe's channel, Majesty of Reason. So keep an eye out for Dustin's debate there. But yeah, we covered a lot on just those 2 things. It was really fun, really stimulating. So thanks for being here. Thanks for the discussion. Any final remarks? Anything else you need to plug that I forgot?
No, I guess not. I mean, I've been doing a little bit of blogging at my website. People can look at that, I suppose. I might start blogging over Medium at some point. So maybe
Nice.
that once I start. But I do have this co-authored book on applied ethics that's coming out, I think, next year. So if you're watching this in the future, then you can look up that book and get it, I guess. But,
yeah, there you go. Or just have it on your pre-order list, on your wish list for next Christmas or something. Yeah.
Put it down now.
Yeah, you gotta get on the blog. You gotta write that infamous blog about David Bentley Hart and analytic philosophy. I need that one. So I don't have to keep tagging people on Facebook and comment threads. I can just send them a blog post, and I'm not gonna make Dustin type this all out again. Let me find the post and tag you. So it is funny if you look at that post. So my friend August, he's tagged. You see in that thread, there's 10 people. 10 people have just been tagged because people be like, where is he said this? And we'll find it. It's tag 20 people in that one. But yeah, that's good. Yeah, check out all Dustin's stuff, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.